Hi, everybody. This is Josh Mansky with the Corn Belt Newsletter podcast. I have the honor today of having one of my favorites on the podcast today, Mr. Chad Hart from Iowa State University. Chad, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Hey, we got a little water here today, which is actually a good thing.
Definitely. Yes. We've been very dry down in the southwest part of Iowa, so
Yeah.
it's a much needed much needed rain for us. Chad, let's get right into it. Maybe a little bit of a review of the 25 year. I know when you and I last talked on the podcast here, we were talking about a 181 yield and how the stars were going to have to align. Well, we blew that out of the water, 186 and extra acres. And yeah, why don't we just start there and then we can get into your presentation.
Oh yeah. So I think when you look at 2025, it was a great year for crop production, but it was also a great year for crop diseases and things like that. When you look back at the corn market, for example, it seemed like every time USDA looked at that crop, it got a little bigger. It got bigger in terms of the acreage we saw. If you think back to this time last year, we were looking at them saying 95 million corn acres. We ended up at 98.8 million. When you looked at the yield, they were at 181. Well, we end up at 186.5. And what we saw was this combination of a truly record yield when you look across the country, even though Iowa and Illinois did not actually have the best crop they've ever seen. What we saw was a lot of places in, say, the Great Plains, from the Dakotas down to Texas. When you look down south in the southeast, we saw some of the best corn crops coming out of those spots ever. And it was because we had basically a really good planting window to start out with for the year, followed up by plenty of moisture with that for that crop to work with. And that moisture brought up some things like southern rust, which did create some problems here, especially in Iowa and Illinois. But basically, it was that those weather conditions that really provided the impetus that created what turned out to be, based on USDA's numbers right now, the biggest corn crop we have ever seen by over 10%, a 17 billion bushel corn crop. Our previous record was 15.3. And you saw that same yield, you know, explosion sort of on the soybean side as well, even though we didn't plant as many acres. Again, a record yield there across the country. Here's a case where even Iowa got in on the records there. And so it was an incredibly strong production year, despite all the trouble we had with things like diseases like southern rust, despite the challenges we faced in terms of the costs that continue to remain very high. But the idea is, yeah, from a production standpoint, it's just an incredible year, 2025.
Yeah, I think to your point, as we were discussing just before we got recording here, in order to have that sort of disease pressure, you have to have moisture, right? And it didn't affect all varieties. There were some varieties it affected much worse than others. But
Well, that's the
to your point,
Yep. I mean, what we tend to see is when these diseases pop up, I'm always reminded, and I'm sure you've had plant pathologists on here before, where they talk about the disease triangle, where you have to have basically the host plant for it doing well. You have to have the weather conditions that are right for it, and the idea is it has to be there. And we had that, if you will, the perfect triangle here. But arguably, the perfect triangle for crop diseases is also one of the perfect triangles for growing crops, as you looked here. So to get a record yield in corn and soybeans in the same year, we had to have really good moisture, which a lot of diseases like as well. We had to have good warm temperatures to allow that crop to grow to full maturity. That helps propagate a lot of diseases. And so it does mean, yeah, in these better years, we do face more of a challenge there. And especially if a certain variety or certain production technique doesn't allow you to protect against that disease, it can take a big bite out of you.
there's no doubt about that. There was some yield numbers that were just devastating on the farm level. Yeah. So a growing season to remember for sure. Looking here to 2026, we're taping today on the 3rd of April. Why don't we have your slides pulled up there, Chad?
Sure.
The infamous slides.
Are they that infamous?
They're very infamous, at least to this guy on the other end of the screen.
So yeah, when we're looking at the outlook, and I'll rehash a little bit of what we were talking about in 2025, is that if you look at the numbers where USDA is currently at, and I always like to tell folks, don't get too comfortable with the numbers on the far right of these slides because we know they will shift. And so as we look here at, in this case, the last four crop years we've had, 2022 to 2025, and right now, I'd say it's USDA's first guess at what we're going to do here in 2026. What you're staring at are four, if the 2026 number is even close to right, four of the top five corn crops we've ever had in this country. So we're talking about strong production. 2025 was just a classic example of that. But when you look back over time, we've had consistently national yields above 170. In fact, for the past 2 years in a row, we've set a record for our national yield. So we've always had plenty of bushels to work with. The question has always been about, can usage chew through that entire crop? And that's what's been sort of interesting, if you will, about, again, the 2025 crop year. Again, we produced the biggest crop we've ever had, but we really didn't see prices suffer that greatly. Now, one reason why is because our prices were already down because of the previous good crops that we've had. But typically, if I were to tell folks we're going to have a record crop this year, we would expect prices to move down even from here. We really didn't see a lot of downward movement. And that's because when you look at the gray box here at the bottom of the slide, that's the corn usage, the demand side of the equation. We continue to find ways to use more and more corn. We're getting it out through the feed markets as we grow animals to larger weights. We are using more for ethanol, and especially given where oil and gas prices now, you could see that trying to grow a bit more as we try to incorporate more lower cost fuels like ethanol into what we do. And we've seen actually a really good surge in exports over the past 16 months for the corn market, which I think surprises some folks given the tariff turmoil we've had over the past year. But it really came down to how big is China in that trade market to determine whether you saw that those exports take a step back or not. For corn, China's never been a big market for us, and so we've seen, like I say, this surge in export sales. For soybeans, we're going to tell a different story there, where we're
Mhm.
not seeing that growth. And like I say, it really comes down to that when I separate the markets. But as you look at usage here, we set a record with 2023 crop. We beat that record in 24. We're beating that record now with the 2025 crop. And the deal is, as we look forward into 26, we don't think we'll keep up the record pace, but hopefully the usage will remain strong enough, and that, in this case, production may pull back enough to allow that usage to catch up to supplies. In fact, that's what was most heartening about what came out a few days ago with the prospective plantings report. Farmers were surveyed around the country. The numbers came back and it pointed to 95.3 million acres of corn being planted this spring, which would be 3.5 million less than we did last year, but still will result in a big crop. In fact, if we put trendline yield to that of 183 bushels, that's going to produce the second biggest crop we've ever had. 15, nearly 16 billion bushels. But that is over a billion bushels less than we just did. So that's saying supplies are slowing down. And as long as usage can keep close to where it is today, it helps tighten the markets up a bit and provide, let's call it an avenue for better prices. And I would say the market's sort of reflecting that. If we look out at the futures market, and I'll pull up
Right.
that slide here a little later, we've got the slope of hope out there. The idea is the further out we look, we do see those stronger prices. And I'm going to argue a lot of that is built upon this idea of what USDA's laid out in these numbers. That supplies slow down a bit, but production keeps or consumption keeps chugging along, working through this corn, leading to higher prices. Now, we're not seeing the higher prices in USDA's guess as they look out there right now. If you look down the bottom right-hand corner, they're shooting at a 420 price. I'm going to tell you right now, Futures market would say that should be more in the 470 to 480 range. A really good price, especially compared to where we've been, but we also do know that costs have increased, especially if you are looking at buying fertilizer right now. Yeah, you're feeling the pinch
Ouch.
as we look at there. But that's the game as we see it today in the corn market. Flipping over to soybeans, it's sort of this tale of if that acreage is getting out of corn, where's it going to go? Headed to beans. And yeah, it's exactly what the survey reflected here. So that 3.5 million acres out of corn shows up here in the bean market. Now, here though, we have this challenge of production has been strong, not quite the record levels of overall production that we've seen on the corn side, but still, we've produced again, if these numbers are right across this table, you're looking at 4 of the top 5 soybean crops we've ever had as well. But what we've also seen here is that, if you will, production and usage have both just been moving together year after year after year. In fact, it's amazing as I look down at the ending stocks line in this, sort of how consistent ending stocks have been year after year. So this market is actually fairly tight, but it doesn't feel that way given where prices are. And I would argue it's because in this case, we have to look at the global situation in soybeans. For the corn market, and I'll go back here, when we look at the corn table, I would say the US corn table sort of tells you sort of what's happening within the world. Because we are the biggest producer of corn, we're the biggest user of corn in the world. When it comes to soybeans, we used to be that as well, but we're no longer. Brazil's the biggest producer, China's the biggest user. So what's happening in our market is meaningful, but it's only part of the story. We have to look at what's happening with global supplies and global demand. And so while we've seen supply and usage sort of moving together worldwide, what we're seeing is production exceeding usage because of the growth coming out of Brazil and because of the slowdown we've seen with China. And that's leading to these lower prices we've experienced over the past few years in the soybean market. As you look here, exports have not been growing. We haven't seen the record pace like we're seeing in the corn market because the trade issues we have with China. And so looking forward into 2026, what is supporting this market right now is this idea of that we look to use more soybeans domestically here through our domestic crush, especially looking at biofuel production. And that's one of the areas where, again, the current administration has proposed updating the targets within our biofuel categories to utilize more U.S. soybeans. So we continue to see growth there, but the big wild card is how much will we sell in the overseas markets, specifically how much will go to China, because we know that China will drive where the market ultimately goes. If they're needing beans, we'll go higher. If they're not needing those beans, we'll sit here in the doldrums. And at least right now, I would say we're hopeful we'll continue to see a little more usage there.
Well,
As we're
Chad,
looking at, yep.
yeah, on the not to interrupt you, but
Oh, you're fine.
for what I've always, when you're speaking, you're like, okay, exports are always the kind of the catalyst as far as future price movement. So if you go back a slide to corn, right? Corn's what 20% roughly is used for exports. And
Yep.
if you look on that chart from 22, 23, 24, 25, that number just keeps going up. Now they're dropping that estimate a little bit for 26, but our corn exports have been extremely strong. And really the market has been, as of now, has been relatively flat, even with those good export numbers.
Yep.
I mean, what do you think the reason is for that? And to your point, looking out to the futures, like if we look at new crop December, I mean, I'd have to go look at what that is today. It's got to be in that 470, 480 mark.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I'll say it this way. One, our export levels do tend to move with the size of the crop. So, in fact, let me show you that. Bear with me. Let's jump forward a bit.
Oh, I didn't mean to get through all the fun slides.
Oh no,
I
you
got way
can.
too far ahead.
This will. I love playing tennis like this. This is looking at week by week how much we sold to the rest of the world here. And these lines represent different years. So you can think of the red line as what we're doing so far this year. It's starting out at harvest last fall and tracking weekly. How much are we selling to the rest of the globe? The gray line was our best export year ever. That would be back here at 2024 now, which you can see, well, it's 2021 early on, and then it becomes 2024 later. You look at the green line, that was last year. The black line's our 5-year average, and then that blue line down there on the bottom is one of our worst export years, and that turned out to be 2012. And I like to include that because what that points out is exports don't tend to fall because there's necessarily a demand problem. It tends to be more of a supply issue. And so we would expect with a big crop that we would see big exports, which is definitely what we're seeing in the corn market. As you brought up, though, just because there's record exports doesn't mean prices necessarily improve. And the reason is because when we think about it, part of the reason we have these record sales is because we've got that record crop. So you've got the record crop pricing down on prices. At the same time, you've got exports pressing up. And right now, those two forces have sort of, stabilized each other. But what I want to point out is that over time, if that demand keeps pressing up, we continue to eat through supplies, it will get stronger than the downside force. And what we see in the market, so bear with me, this is where we closed before the markets, closed today. And when you look out there at December 2026, yeah, we're in here at about 481 right now. And when I take these futures market prices and see what they say about that season average price that USDA talks about, like I say, it's pointing to 475 right now, not 420. So this is saying that if you wanted to in the market today, if I locked in my sales, if the nation locked in its sales as it normally does throughout the year based on these futures, we would end up at 475, not 420. So that's telling you the market is offering right now a premium compared to what USDA thinks is going to happen. Why would it do that? I would argue it would do that because it sees the strength in those export markets remaining there throughout the year. At the same time, too, we're expected to plant a little less corn. So it's this combination of, yeah, that usage is pushing up. Right now, it's kept prices sort of stable. But the argument is over time, it will help raise prices up if we can keep that demand flowing. And that's going to be a storyline you see for soybeans as well as we look there. That's the challenge that we have. But it all comes back to this idea of balancing out the supplies that we've got with the ways we can use the crop. So yeah, as you can tell, I've spent a lot of time thinking about those corn exports, and the reason
Right.
like I say, I hang on those a lot is because this is the quickest part of our demand structure. In fact, let me take you back here again. When we look at these tables and you look at that, bear with me. And when you look down at that gray box, the feed market can only move as fast as we can change the size of our herds. And we know the biggest mover within the feed market is the cattle industry. Well, how long does it really take to change the size of the herd?
It's going to be a while,
It's
especially with
going to,
as small as the herd has been. I mean, that's been, my feelings the whole time, like feed and residual seems like that's going to be a fairly locked in number,
bingo.
maybe on the high side at the moment, Chad, for a while.
It is.
I mean,
And
because
yeah,
until people start retaining heifers and this herd starts to grow again, I don't know any upside you're going to have on that feed number.
yeah, I would agree. And it's because, yeah, as you say, it literally takes a couple of years to grow the herd. I would argue the ethanol line sort of works the same way. Because if you think about growing the ethanol market up, right now, what you're seeing is the industry's running about as strong as it can right now. So for it to grow more, we're going to need to either expand, capacity at these existing plants or build a new one. That's going to take a year or two.
So
But when
question,
it comes,
so a quick
hmm,
question on that front
shoot,
then. So you think of
yeah,
demand for ethanol, right? If you had year-round E15 availability, what I'm hearing you say is that's kind of like the feed number that will help, but that's going to take time in order to
yeah,
get capacity in order to really increase that demand number.
Agreed. What you're looking at with ethanol. So bear with me.
Here we
This
go.
shows
We
this
are
shows I have a
Tennessee.
slide for everything.
Yeah, we are Tennessee today.
Yes. So when you're looking at the corn grind, what we've had over the especially the past, you know, couple of years is just incredibly consistent corn usage there. And we produce about 16 billion gallons of ethanol. The problem is right now we only sort of have the capacity to use about 15 billion of it. So we export the other billion. That tells you even here I have to talk about exports. But it's this case of okay, E15. Is it a good strategy to grow to markets? The answer is yes, but it's in the long run. In the short run, really won't do that much to change this picture because the biggest challenge in E15 is not producing the fuel. In fact, I could argue right now, we've got that billion gallons we already export. We could keep that here if the E15 market could handle it right now. The reason it really can't is because we don't have those that many pumps available for consumers to utilize. E15's challenge is this is that there's 120,000 gas stations across the country. Only 3,000 of them have an E15 pump. And you got to think about how long does it take to get a new pump into a convenience store or gas station? Even here in Iowa, when you look at where those E15 pumps are, they tend to be in newer convenience stores or gas stations where they were putting in a new pump anyway, and E15 makes sense to build that in because you really don't want to just drop E15 in any old gas tank. Because if you do, we know we could have user issues there. While ethanol is a great fuel, it's also a great solvent, which means it loves to clean up all the gunk that gasoline leaves behind. And that's why you don't want to put E15 in a 40-year-old pump out in the middle of nowhere. Is what it's going to do is bring up all that sludge and it's going to try to shove it through the fuel filter in your car, which is never a good thing. So to me, it's more about building that pump infrastructure across the country so that more consumers have access to E15, and then you're getting that growth that we're looking for. But like I say, that's like growing the cattle herd. It takes a couple of years to get true progress to change the numbers there. And so, when you're thinking about biofuels, I'm going to point out the quick place we can grow is not corn and ethanol, it's renewable diesel and soybeans. And that's where we continue to see growth. That's where, as you look at this graph, this shows you that we had been on a growth path there till last year. And then we saw this industry, as I like to describe it, pucker up. That we weren't sure what government policy was going to look like. We were seeing more challenging markets for biofuels to really play in. And so you saw the industry retreat a bit here with the announcements of the renewable fuel standard settings for 2026 and 2027. That's offering more certainty for policy here, but also the targets we're shooting for now should put us back on that growth path we were on. And that's really good news for the soybean market because if China's not going to be buying on the export side, we have to figure out internally what to do with the beans that we have. Because we have really, and if I were to take us back to the soybean table, in fact, bear with me.
Go for it.
You look at all these acres we have here. The reason we're planting over 80 million acres of soybeans traditionally has been because nearly half those beans we knew were leaving the country.
Right.
And the vast majority of those we knew were headed to China. Well, now there's a good question. They may not be headed there. What do you do then? Well, we're sitting there going, you know what? Maybe we can build that usage here because let's call it that's always the long run challenge, whether I'm talking corn, soybeans, heck, beef, pork, whatever. Here in the US, we have always had the capability of producing not only bountiful crops, but the idea is that continue to build sort of year after year after year. That if you look at that yield line in this chart, whether I'm looking soybeans or corn, we know that there's a trend where that's always sloping higher. That even if I know nothing else about the crop year, we should expect more beans than we produced in the past, more corn than we produced in the past, which means you're always looking for new or expanding ways to use that crop. And if I go back to corn, if you think about ethanol, ethanol really got its start because back in the 1980s and 1990s, we had a lot of corn and we didn't know what we were going to do with it all. And so we were looking for new usage and we thought, you know what? Hey, fuel markets. After all, Henry Ford, when he was working on the Model T, there was an ethanol version of that back in the day. Maybe we can kickstart that up again. And that's turned out to be an incredible, um, now mature market for us that's using up 35-40% of the corn that we produce. Now we're looking to do the same thing on the soybean side. And that's the hope as we're looking at renewable diesel. But I would say that's the deal. We're always looking for new markets. And so if I'm looking for them quickly, I will tell you I'm looking at different countries. Who can we sell to that we haven't sold to more? When I'm looking long term, we have to look more internally. How can we utilize more corn here over time? And then what you want to be doing is building, let's call it both the short term and long term usage to hopefully, you know, create a better, let's call it pathway forward for farmers.
Well, Chad, I'm looking at the soybean chart here, to your point. So you're looking at exports, those numbers, of course, it looks, if you had your chart going back to 2017, you'd see the dramatic decrease in
Yeah.
exports. Of course, 2025 being one of the weakest years. And now 26, they're that 1.7 number. Are they predicting that China's going to be coming in? Is that where they're getting that
Uh, they're,
increase?
they're projecting a little better. So, I showed you this chart for corn. Now let's look at it for soybeans. And here you can see there's that record up there in gray. That's 2021. That was our best export year ever as far as number of bushels out there. The black line is our 5-year average. So that tells you we're used to seeing fairly strong exports. And then that red line is where we're at right now. So you can see, even if we go to next year and that's 1.7 billion bushels being projected out there, that would still be a below average year. But yeah, it's saying that China will step in a bit more. Because when you think about who we sell to, in this case, I want you to think that China is still our biggest market. Despite all the turmoil of the past year, despite them sitting on the sidelines for months at a time, when they came back in, they immediately snapped back up to being at the front of the line right now. So in this case, this graphic, the first 6 bars each have a country name by them. Those are our top 6 export markets right now. This was updated as of actually yesterday morning.
Out off the presses.
Yes, hot off the presses. The bar size tells you sort of the change year over year. So, like in this case, you can see China is down about 390 million bushels compared to last year.
Wow.
Big drop, yet even with that big drop, like I say, they're still our biggest market. Mexico's number 2. You can see some small growth there. Egypt's number 3 right now. Lots of growth there. And I will tell you, Egypt is not traditionally our 3rd biggest market. Having Egypt in this table tells me something, though. I will say Egypt is a market that is usually very price sensitive. So when they show up in these tables for me, that tells me we are well priced to sell to the rest of the world. But you can also see that, where we're still fighting over tariffs, we're seeing big drops. Other markets where we're not fighting over tariffs anymore, we're seeing mostly gains. And so it's this matter of putting together enough markets for growth there. But traditionally, over the past couple of decades, the growth engine in this market was that Chinese market. Now we're trying to figure out how do you grow outside of that. And the problem is when we look internationally, there isn't just one place you need to be. You need to be in a lot of places to replace a China.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
That makes the logistics of it difficult. But
Makes it.
if you go back to not to tennis racket back and forth, but your crush numbers on that chart, Chad.
Yep.
Again,
So when you're looking,
interesting number there, right? So we're looking at that 2.2 and 22, fairly consistent. All of a sudden, we're starting to more crush plants are coming online. Now we're 2.6. So we are starting to produce more soy oil here in the United States. Right. If you're thinking long term, what that means for us. not as heavily reliant on exports, but still reliant heavily on exports. I mean, even if
Yeah.
I mean you're probably 40 to 45% of that soy your soybean usage is export still, regardless of how you cut it.
Well, that's the deal. You're looking at, okay, those beans we crush here, the oil more than likely is going to go to that renewable diesel spot. The meal, we're going to use a good amount of it. But yeah, we're going to export all as well. And when you're looking at soybean meal exports over the past 3 years, we have been setting records there. Don't have the chart here in front of us, but the idea is, yeah, each of the past 3 years, as we've watched that crush build up, and we've watched our own livestock markets sort of stay the same size, it meant that meal had to find a home elsewhere. And where we've been finding those markets are places like Mexico, the Philippines, Taiwan, South Korea, one of my favorite ones, Vietnam. And these are not traditional markets for us necessarily, or nor are they traditional markets where we think soybean meal would go. But what we've been doing is developing these trade relationships, figuring out how can we take the products we grow here and fit them into the cultural and business practices of a place like Vietnam. And in the case here, when we think soybean meal, I think we tend to think of, feeding like, the pork industry or the poultry industry. There, we're doing aquaculture. We're creating little pellets of the soybean meal to feed fish. But that fits well for them. Because one of the biggest drivers, I would argue, of the crush market is always knowing where you're going to go with the oil or meal. And that goes back to livestock. And what we're seeing in the livestock markets, and I've got the US numbers here, but when you think globally, the deal is this. Here in the US, our meat markets are fairly, let's call it consistent. We're going to produce 107 to 108 billion pounds of meat each and every year. What we're seeing though is sort of a change in that mix. Little less beef because that herd has shrunk, and a little growth on the pork and broiler side. And what we're also seeing is demand for protein is very strong. People are willing to pay the prices to get the steak in the center of the plate. We're seeing good prices for, like chicken, and especially in this case, I'll argue here in the US market, the beef market is able to it's selling less product, but at a really high price. The chicken market is selling more product at a lower price, but for convenience and quickness. And so we're seeing, I would argue, a really good protein market here in the US. When you look worldwide, it's a growing market. And that growth in that market is leading to things like our soybean exports continuing to grow. In fact, I'll show our corn exports here. They're up 30%. The reason we're able to sell corn and soybean meal like we are is because of that need for feed to create that protein to fill the global consumer. And that is a beautiful pattern if you're a US producer, because that means there's demand out there globally for the products that we grow.
And in some of those countries, I'm guessing it's emerging markets within those economies.
Oh,
Like I
yeah.
think of Colombia. Colombia is a good
Hmm.
example. I don't think many people maybe realize how much of our corn gets exported to Colombia. It's a
Yep.
decent amount of it. And I think they're in the top five, are they not, Chad?
They're number four right now. As you can see on this chart, I've got them in order here again.
There you
Mexico is
go.
number one, Japan two, South Korea three, Colombia four. And like I say, I think Colombia does surprise folks, but it's one of those markets where you can think of as, you know, that country has it's different than its perception has always been. When we think about Colombia, we tend to think about illicit drugs and things like that. While they still have their issues, it's a more stable country now with a growing economy. And with growing economies, what you see are, you know, greater income. And as people get more income, they tend to, spend it to, improve their lives. And one of the easiest ways to improve your life is improve your diet. And so we tend to see more protein, more meat demand as incomes grow within a country. And that's why Colombia has went from being a really small market for US corn to being, yeah, now the fourth largest market we have when it comes to international sales. And so, like I say, we're seeing this, in lots of different places. That's, that's why I point out like Egypt here on the soybean side, Colombia here on the corn side. These are countries you don't necessarily expect, but that's now where we see the largest potential for growth.
Chad, has Egypt been a buyer for a number of years? And is it just because of the price has been right for them to buy? They're all of a sudden one of the leading countries that are buying from us.
Well, I would say Egypt has always been in our markets, but yeah, they are, let's call it, they're always looking for a value proposition. So it's not that they're always big in soybeans, for example. They'll pop up for a while, they'll disappear for a while because they are shopping around. And in this case, with them popping up, that tells me, like I say, we're well priced because if they could find a better deal from Brazil, they would move there. So they are very price sensitive that way. And when it comes to the export markets, I'll pick on soybeans here, is that when you look at it, there's only two big sellers really across the global market. There's the US, there's Brazil. Argentina sells some, but they tend to sell more soybean meal and soybean oil than soybeans directly. And so a country like Egypt, yeah, they tend to move back and forth between the US and Brazil based upon price. What we're seeing right now is China's moved strongly towards Brazil. That has opened up opportunities for US soybeans to hit those value markets. And we're definitely pulling that off now. Um, the problem is that in making that shift, as you say, like I say, we have to hit a bunch of different markets at the same time. That is difficult to do in a short amount of time. It takes a while to reroute the traffic to get things back in balance when it comes to the export markets. But it can be done. And that's one thing, that's why I like looking at the corn chart because that shows you right now that is what we're seeing in corn, that it is sort of a global push up, whether I'm looking at Latin America or Europe or Asia for that point. We're seeing expansion sort of across the board, and the U.S. producers have been able to take advantage of those opportunities and sales.
I'm getting a feel like you're long term fairly bullish on both, actually.
Let's call it somewhat bullish, but I think that,
Okay.
there are concerns here as well, and we mentioned a big one. In fact, let me go back here. We were talking about acreage, and I'll bring this up because
Yeah,
since I've
let's
got it
go.
listed here.
Let's hammer into this. I think this is, very timely. Obviously, we just had acreage numbers released here this week.
Yep. So what folks are seeing here on the screen is looking back at the last couple of years and including this year's survey that drove the prospective plantings report. So where did we get those corn and soybean acreage numbers? In this case, USDA surveys farmers during basically the latter couple of days in February into about mid-March. And this is showing you the timing. When did the survey responses come in? And I know I've been getting questions about, okay, given that acreage number, well, was the war and the impact on fertilizer prices and diesel prices, was that fully captured within these acreage estimates? And the answer is no, but some of it was. As you look here on the right-hand side with the orange bars there, that's showing the timing of when people responded to the 2026 survey. And you can see there was about 2 days in, then the war started, then about another week occurred before we saw oil really pop higher. And along with that, fertilizer prices popping higher. So what that also shows though is that there was probably a good, 1/3 to maybe up to 40% of responses were after that. So that those producers could reflect on the higher fertilizer prices they were seeing in making their acreage allocation, where there were others, probably somewhere between 60 to 70% that had answered before that. But it goes back to this idea of that what we're seeing right now is while I'm seeing the potential for higher prices, I'm also seeing the potential for higher costs. So, yes, I'm more bullish that prices will go higher, but what I'm concerned about is that cost may, if you will, keep up with us and or maybe stay ahead of us when we're looking forward here. Because when we're looking here, it may not be the fertilizer that gets you this year, because a lot of folks have, they made those purchases last fall. We applied a lot last fall. Or you maybe repurchased ahead of time for spring. So, it may not hit you this year, but the concern would be looking forward to next year. And especially it goes back to this idea of what we're looking at here is how quickly can the oil industry rebound once this conflict is over? Because those oil prices and natural gas prices are direct inputs into not only creating fertilizer and agricultural chemicals, but you can figure they're direct inputs even into, corn and soybean production. Diesel is a big bill that we have to pay here if you want to farm. And so we know that the longer those energy prices stay high, the longer our input costs stay high, which would mean I need those output prices, those corn and soybean prices, to rise to keep up with that. And so that is a big deal here. But as I look here, I would tell you that, it's not that USDA could change the timing of this to try to create a more accurate estimate after the war. They'll come back when they normally do in June, and we'll reassess there. But I would say, given what we know about the timing here now, and we can see sort of that some folks were able to respond even after those high prices, that we did see that being reflected in the acreage number. And what we saw was basically this, that farmers pulled back a little bit in terms of total land we're going to plant. This is what they call principal crop area. So take the top 20 crops that are grown across the country, add all that acreage together. Normally, I'd say traditionally, I'm used to thinking about this in the 315 to 320 million acre range. We're looking at 310 million acres this year, which is down about 1.5 million from last year. So this is saying that, we're pulling a little bit of a land out of principal crop production. And this is not taking into account any sort of weather problems. This is what do people intend to do today before we can even run the planter. Now, when you look at, within each crop, the idea is we may see some changes over time, but what tends to happen from here to June is that what we say in total tends to hold pretty well as an upper bound. If you look back to last year, we added maybe 1.5 million acres from what we intended to plant, given the great conditions that we had. That's about as much as I've ever seen us add over my career. On the other hand, if Mother Nature slows us down, she can slow us down tremendously. And if you go back to like 2019, we saw that intended acreage was nearly 13.5 million acres above what we actually got done. So it's much more likely we'll have less land in production than even we guess here today. But what we guessed here today was about 180 million acres between corn and soybeans. And when we looked at where the changes were, in the case of corn, we saw a lot of the upper Midwest and Corn Belt reducing corn area. You see some growth still down in the Southern Plains and the Southeast, but for the most part, a general reduction in corn planting, which I would argue we should have expected because, one, with the higher energy prices, higher fertilizer prices, people tend to look for lower cost crops to produce. Corn's pretty high cost. So we tend to see a pullback when we see higher energy prices. Same time, too, we just planted a boatload of corn last year. Post World War II, that's the most corn area we have had. So it makes sense from a agronomic rotational perspective, we would pull back on corn and move to other crops, which is what we're ending up doing. Pulling back on corn to add some more soybeans. And that's the deal. When you look at the upper Midwest, that's what the deal is. We basically are taking 3.5 million acres out of corn, and we're basically placing it in soybeans, maintaining that agronomic rotation, and at the same time, trying to reduce the impact of higher input costs like we're seeing in fertilizer right now. So I would argue the report already sort of reflects the changes we would expect to see given the higher energy and fertilizer prices we're experiencing today.
Thoughts on that corn number that obviously came out on the 31st, Chad, is, I mean, does your gut tell you with survey respondents, war in Iran, that number is, would you be shocked if that number was higher?
Um, I wouldn't say I'd be shocked. I was in this camp. I had been pretty much thinking 95 to 96 the entire time here. And so I was really comfortable when the numbers came out. I'm like, yeah, this is sort of what I was expecting. And it's because when I'm looking at corn here, especially, again, a lot of these moves were made before the Iran war started and all that. Because if you applied fertilizer last fall,
Right.
we know what that land's going to. You put manure out there sometime over this time, we know what that land's going to. So what we're really talking about here is that land that, well, and let's face it, we always have to have that 10 to 20% of acres that have to shift during the year, depending upon what Mother Nature is going to do to us. Last year, great year for planting. We added corn. This year, I think everybody's expecting a more challenging weather season. Heck, as I talked about the rain here today, we've been dry. We could use the moisture, but at the same time, too, we know that the moisture will tend to slow us down some. And so I think this is the market and farmers within it saying, you know what? This would be the sort of, let's call it the happy balance. Um, we're more confident, I would say, with the corn market in terms of the demand structure we've got there than we are with soybeans. But soybeans offers us the more comfortable input cost decisions. And I think this little shift of about 3.5 million acres between the crops is reflecting a rebalancing to try to let's call it minimize the impact of those higher input costs while at the same time too trying to take advantage of the growth we're seeing in the corn market.
It's yeah, that balance. I have no doubt about that. I'm trying to think, what other slides do we have on here, Chad? That we
Oh,
make sure we're hitting on.
Lord only knows. So
I
so
well,
I'll
I
put
know I know we've been going back and forth here. The acreage number, that makes me feel a little bit more confident. Of course, your opinion matters a lot to a lot of us out here. So that 95 million acre, I mean, the estimates, my goodness, before the report came out were from like 92 to 98. I'm like,
oh
well,
yeah,
goodness, I mean, that could be, that's a pretty wide range, and they
it
kind of
is.
right in between the middle of them all.
And how to put this, it could still happen. I mean, we could still see,
Right.
Mother Nature will determine. But the big one to me, and I'll go back to something we've been skipping over, and this is the stocks report.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
And
Because the
so,
stock numbers came out as well. I forgot about
yep,
that.
stocks number came out well, and I think the stock numbers, but though they help confirm something for us. That, as I mentioned, this past crop we pulled out this last fall, like I say, the biggest one we ever seen. So we were talking about production of 17 billion bushels, overall supplies over 18 and a half. We've never seen that much corn in one fall. And when you look at how we've been using those crops up, what I measure here, and I'll call off that little table on the right hand side here, is if you think back to, last year versus this year, we started out the year with nearly 2 billion more bushels of corn in storage. By the time we got to December, we had reduced that excess to 1.2 million. By the time we got here to March, we've reduced it down to less than 900 million. So what that tells you is we're using corn more quickly than we did last year. And if you think back to last year, we actually did see stocks drop, that we burned through more corn than we had created last year. If we can pull that off again, that sets the scenario for improving prices. So this just confirms, if you will, that yeah, what USD is projecting on that usage side, it's happening. We're seeing the export sales. We're seeing the usage in ethanol. We're seeing the feed demand continue to work through this crop. We still have a massive amount in storage. Don't get me wrong. There's 9 billion bushels still in storage. But the idea is we're using that up pretty quickly. Just within the past 3 months, we've used basically 4.3 billion bushels. That's amazing usage. We've never seen usage anywhere near that big. So that's the great story for corn, and why I say that we continue to want to feed that market, because we see that usage continuing to be able to churn through here and create the higher prices there. We're not seeing that same sort of churn on the soybean side. In fact, if anything here, the problem is that we actually, while it was a great yielding crop, it wasn't the biggest production crop we've ever had. And in fact, total supplies this year were smaller than last year. But as we sit here in March, we still have more left over now than we did a year ago. And we know that the biggest chunk of that is because of a lack of sales to China, that the trade disruptions there have taken a bite here. And so that's also why I said, we see a little movement, but not a giant movement in soybeans, because we're more concerned about what is that usage going to look like here. Will China step back in to be the market we know they can be for us or not? And I think there's some hope out there, but I don't, I think the USDA numbers reflect some growth there, but not getting back to where they once were.
I think that's a very important point, because on the corn side of things, if we look at the futures market and what that's telling us, right? Old crop is, like I said, has been relatively flat. It seems like it's taken a lot to move that one way or another on the old crop side of things. On the new crop side of things, right, we're seeing that number at for almost
Yep.
480 bushel
That's
today.
it. You see that, as I call it, the slope of hope. You see that building up
Yeah.
over time. Now, in this case, I'll say the whole complex has shifted up over time. Same thing's happening with soybeans, but what you see instead of the slope of hope is I got a tabletop. That the markets really aren't moving between what you're seeing nearby to what we're seeing far out into 2027. And to me, that's reflecting this uncertainty about international sales. That when it comes here to within our US demand, yep, we've been showing that has been growing over time, but that's pretty much just matching our ability to produce. That in the grand scheme of things, it's going to be those international sales. And specifically, again, here, it's going to be China, that we know that it's that market alone moves this entire pricing complex.
Yeah, I'm trying to
It,
remember the number that China was uh what they were going to be trying to buy from us the next 2 years, or at least said it had been
25 million metric tons.
25 million metric tons. Okay, so all
Yep.
right, let's say that would come to fruition. Now, do
Mm-hmm.
you think if that was something that was that was a signed agreement somewhere, that the futures market would reflect that? If
Yep.
that was the case, looking at the numbers as we have them today, this flat level has to be like this, does it not? It has to be
Uh, doesn't have to go like that, but I would argue the whole thing comes up.
comes up like
So if,
that.
if you're thinking here, so I'll go back, bear with me. Um, go back here to the table. So if you're looking at where we're at right now, um, the 1575 that we're shooting for the 2025 crop is reflecting China at about half of that. Um, if they were to go fully to that 25 million metric tons, that would be somewhere north of 900 million bushels. In fact, probably closer to 1,000 or a billion. So that would tell you, okay, we should be seeing a substantial bounce in that 2026 export number. We're not. We're seeing 125 million. Yeah, it's decent. That's not reflecting the big shift we should expect to see if China were to fully reflect that. In fact, the way I like to describe it is this, and I'll go back to this chart that I showed you before, that if you look right now, what they sort of said or what was sort of outlined by President Trump back last fall was the idea of he had the call with President Xi. President Xi agreed to buy, I believe it was 12 million tons for the 2025 crop and then 25 million tons for 26 and 27. What you're seeing right now on the table is reflecting that 12 million tons. That told me that China was going to buy about half what they usually do. And if you look this year, that's basically where they are. They're about half. If you looked right now, they're down 48.5% from the year before. To get back to 2026 levels, that means that entire 390 million bushels comes back into the marketplace. Instead, USDA showing growth of 125 million. So that tells you even USDA right now is sort of discounting how much growth we could see out of China, at least in their early estimates. We'll see if that strengthens over time. I think, and I would tell you that's the hope, is that we do see that strengthen over time, that we could put this sort of combination of seeing more sales into China along with growing that biofuel aspect here to create more of an upward slope for the soybean market.
As you can tell, everybody, we're really shooting for the silver lining with all of this.
Well, it's not that we're shooting for a silver lining. I'll go back here. You look here at what we've done in the soybean market over the past year. In fact, bear with me. Let me go off of this chart. This is tracking what the futures market is saying about the season average price over time. So, like I say, every day what I do is I capture the futures market prices, take an average basis off of it to calculate that national average price. That's the USDA number. And if you look since the beginning of 2026 here, so it'd be this far, I guess last 10, 12% of this deal, you can see that we've been on an upward run for the most part. That once we got past the January report, which showed how big the crops were, and we took a step down there, especially for corn,
Yep.
we've worked our way back up. Why have we done that? Because we're seeing really good use for the crops. And in fact, as I'm looking at, the moves we've seen in corn, things have stalled out about here with the eruption of the war. But we're still talking about some of the strongest pricing we have seen right now, the best we've seen over the past couple of years. In fact, let me take you back. This is new crop. This is looking old crop. And you can think the last time we saw 480, 475, I have to go all the way back to the very beginning of 2025. For beans, this is the best price in over 2 years
Right.
that we're seeing today. So we have seen some recovery in the bean market despite all the challenges we're finding here. And again, it goes back to this idea of, yep, we built those crush facilities. We are using them more. We're finding homes for not only the oil through renewable diesel, but for the meal through additional export markets. And if we can continue to sort of build back that base on soybean sales themselves, then we start really talking about a horse race where corn and soybeans are both competitive, if you will, in the land market. The reason corn still dominates right now is because it has the better economic opportunities right now. And that has been the case for at least the past year.
Lot to digest here, Chad.
Well,
Um,
that's the beauty of it all.
I know. Well, your expertise is like I said, so valued. Um, what else do we have on here? I know you and I we wanted to talk about 20, obviously the possible 27 growing season here, the challenges that could be faced this coming fall with fertilizer prices. Why don't we hit
Yeah.
on?
Well, and that's the deal. When I'm looking at production costs right now, and this is something I sort of skipped over here. So if you look at that, there's a bold line there around 440 for the left-hand side. That's the corn price, and the right-hand side's at 1115. Those were Iowa State's production cost estimates as of January. So when we do for Iowa State, we do our production cost estimates once a year. We ended up at 440 corn, 1115 beans. Well, we now know fertilizer prices have drastically changed since then. And especially as we're looking forward to the 2027 crop year, we know that we're going to have to start making some of those input decisions here later this summer. And so the idea of what's happening within the war right now um, possibly has some long-term ramifications for us here. If we look at what the oil futures market says today, that market is indicating that we'll see these higher energy prices for the next month or two, but then prices work their way back down to more normal levels like we were before the war by especially the end of the year. that's the case, then we would expect fertilizer prices to cool off as we go to the latter half of this year. That would be great. The problem with that outlook, though, is that we know that the longer this war goes on, and especially we know given that some of the energy infrastructure in not only Iran, but also in other Gulf countries that Iran's been targeting, like oil fields in Qatar and in Saudi Arabia, that we are seeing damage done to the energy infrastructure in the Middle East. The more damage that occurs there, the harder it is to get that oil and natural gas and those fertilizer supplies moving through the Middle East, meaning the longer we see these high energy prices. And the longer we see those high energy prices means the longer we will see high fertilizer and diesel prices here, raising our cost of production. So while this graph is showing our prices moving higher, what is missing from this graph is we also know that our costs are moving higher. And it really right now is an open question. Which one is moving up more quickly?
The fertilizer prices before all of this started this last fall were not great.
Yeah.
And now I've had some friends that are pricing urea here over the last, since the start of the conflict. And my goodness, Chad, it was unprofitable before, and now it's you can't even hardly you can't even hardly write the check to put the product on the ground,
Yeah, it's incredibly tough. And it's
especially urea.
because when you're looking, especially say post-COVID, the energy markets or fertilizer markets, did they change? I would argue, yes, they did, and it's for a combination of reasons why. One of them is we're having more conflicts that are impacting the energy markets. So, we're fighting with Iran right now. Russia and Ukraine, that was a big deal to especially the natural gas markets. Um, so you're having these conflicts that are driving energy prices up. And you got to remember that oil and natural gas are the key ingredients, for lack of a better term, to make up fertilizer. So that's pushing those fertilizer prices higher. There's also the case of you've got to figure that global demand for fertilizer has continued to grow by leaps and bounds. While we here in the US arguably are fairly consistent on how much synthetic fertilizer we use, if you look at the number of pounds of synthetic nitrogen and the various other fertilizer products that we use that way, those have been fairly stable for us over the last 40 years. But that's because we've been able to incorporate more natural sources of fertilizer, things like manure. That's not true worldwide. When you're looking at places like Brazil or India or China, what you're seeing is tremendous growth in use of synthetic fertilizer. What that means, though, is it's more competition to try to buy that fertilizer, which again drives those costs higher. So, to me, it's not surprising what we're seeing within the fertilizer market. It's this combination of you've got high input costs for the fertilizer market combined with incredibly strong global demand and growing global demand for fertilizers. So while here in the US, we're used to thinking about, well, we're the big market that's pushing things around. No, there are other big markets that are right now, like I say, they're growing in their usage where we're fairly stable. So we can't look at our data and explain why prices are going higher. But when you look at the global picture, it suddenly becomes more clear. Yeah, they're using, twice as much as they did 10 years ago. That has an impact on not only the price they're paying for fertilizer, but the price we are paying for fertilizer because we're in a global market for fertilizer.
Thus the pinch that we're in.
Yep.
Yeah.
But recognize that everybody on the planet is feeling those pinches. That's the challenge here. None of us escape it. It's just a matter of does it hit you on an input side or an output side? I'd say for your farmers, yeah, you're staring at that diesel price, you're staring at that fertilizer price. What that's leading to is higher cost of production for you. That eventually we know shows up in other places, though. for a lot of U.S. consumers, where are they going to feel these pinches? They're going to see a lot of it probably at the grocery store. Especially in this case, the diesel price run up is, I think, one of
Right.
the hidden features here.
Big time.
People wanted to talk to me about the fertilizer showing up in the food price. I'm like, no, it's the diesel that scares me even more.
Well, I mean, think of
Be-
anything that's transported. I mean, I think of our freight costs too. I mean, my goodness, I remember what that was like when diesel was $5 a gallon not that long ago.
yes,
It was not pretty.
it was not pretty, and you think about our food system. Um, let's face it, we move food a long way. I forget who did the study, but it was several years ago. But they showed that like the average meal has about 1,500 miles on it. So that tells you you're paying for a lot of transportation when you're looking at that food bill for that meal. And so, yeah, as you say, yeah, when diesel's moving from $3 a gallon to five, well, that's going to have a big impact on things like. So it's, like I say, farmers are feeling it. I think consumers are feeling it. It's not just here in the US. We know this is happening globally as well. In fact, if anything, I would argue the impacts we're seeing here in the US are sort of, if you will, mitigated a little bit because we are such a large producer of a lot of these different things. So we're not seeing the full impacts like other countries are. But this is truly, it's a global issue that we are seeing these price increases. It's not just a US problem, it's a global issue.
Well, Chad, did you dive? I mean, I know we've got we could be talking on this for another hour or so. Is there anything else that you want to make sure we hit on uh, before we end the podcast today?
Not necessarily. I'll put it this way, though. I mean, what you're seeing is a market that is going through a lot of volatility. But I'll point out not all of that volatility is bad. Like I say, when we're looking at our crop prices right now, over the past couple of months, those have been improving. That does offer up some opportunities for folks to maybe lock in some profits at levels we haven't seen in a while. At the same time, too, we know there are challenges coming up that we are seeing these cost structures. If it's not getting you this year, it may likely get you next year. So that means it's imperative to take advantage of the opportunities we have today. And so that's why when I'm looking at what the markets have done over the past couple of months, this is something we don't want to just let go by. We need to try to take advantage of these prices while we can and try to, like I say, guide ourselves where hopefully we can make a few profitable sales today that can help us weather the potential for more financial storms as we look in the future.
You know that on the new crop side of things, you always have the potential, as we know, for a weather event
Yep.
here. So that's always an opportunity for to market some grain. But I think that's wise advice, especially with soybeans, Chad. I mean, it's almost a 2 year high, like you said. We've got a really big run up since harvest. I,
Yeah.
I I know a lot of guys were not able to capture just for cash flow reasons and whatnot, but you're talking new crop sales possibly here.
Yep.
Um,
I think there's opportunities there. And like I say, when I'm looking now that we've gotten past the acreage report, because I was worried about that being a bigger downward force on the marketplace. We've got through that now and seem to have survived that. I think we could see these prices continue to grow as we're looking forward here because usage is so strong. And so it is looking like a more traditional marketing pattern, seasonal marketing pattern within the markets, which tend to mean our strongest prices late spring, early summer, as being one of those prime opportunities to capture the best price at the time, hopefully before we start to see those input cost pressures building for next fall.
yeah, that's something I think the next time I have you on here, hopefully in the next few months, or maybe after acreage at the end of June. But that is definitely one big concern that I have been talking about too. It's not necessarily the input cost for this growing season. It's coming up here
Yep.
later this year and what that's going to mean for us and what that looks like. And I guess we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But that's definitely something to be considering and thinking about.
It's definitely something we have to continue watching. As you say here, I mean, the problem of being a farmer is you're typically thinking about at least two crops, if not three, at the same time.
I always, that is not that that was ever my line, but I tell people that all the time. It's like we're juggling three crops at any given moment.
Yep.
And, we're thinking about that 27 crop already here coming up, not too long from now.
Yes.
So, Chad, can't tell you how much I appreciate you being on. For people that want to find you, where can I find you?
Easiest way, just Google my name. But yeah, otherwise, I'll recommend the Ag Decision Maker website at Iowa State University. It's basically the website where, my colleagues and I, where we put a lot of the decision tools or fact sheets that we create dealing with agricultural issues. That's our main thing there. Otherwise, if you want the slides that like I put up here today, Google my name. And yeah, you can go to my personal website and I post every darn slide set that I give across the country. So even the ones today, they're up there. You can download them and have them yourself.
Well, I can tell you this much, how much we appreciate all of you, all that you do for all of us in agriculture and the service that you provide. It's like I said, your voice is very important, and it's something I know I look at all the time, and I'm not the only one. So can't tell you how much I appreciate it, Chad.
Thank you.
And everybody, this is Josh Mansky with the Corn Belt Newsletter Podcast, and we will see you next time.